what are the best settings for this monitor? And by best settings, I mean the settings I adopted in my review as my test settings. So they worked on my unit according to my own preferences, and they kept my colorimeters happy. Individual units and preferences vary, so these are only suggestion and won't necessarily be optimal in all cases. So trying to stick to the order things are presented in the menu, starting with the gaming section, I like to make sure that variable refresh rate is enabled, which allows you to use it VRR, including adaptive sync. The next setting to consider is game visual, so that's the preset of the monitor. I would use racing mode or user mode. The others make various adjustments and, for example, increase saturation, oversaturate the image significantly and reduce shade variety and mess the gamma up on purpose, that kind of thing. But obviously if you like the changes that one of these presets makes, then feel free to use it. But user and racing are really the best configured and require the fewest tweaks to get them to look good. The way I set things up when I review monitors is to use the full native gamut, and in that case it's rather wide on this monitor, so that does give oversaturation for standard content, which will be designed with the sRGB color space in mind. If you don't want that and you want to tone things down, then you might want to use the sRGB cal mode. And on my unit that was rather well calibrated. It certainly provided strong color accuracy, but you'll notice that a lot of settings are actually grayed out if you use this. For example, it enforces uniform brightness. You can't adjust the contrast. The color section of the menu, which I haven't shown you yet, it's completely grayed out. You can adjust the brightness at least. If you want a more flexible sRGB emulation setting, which will also clamp the gamut in much the same way, then stick to racing mode or user mode. And in color, you can change the display color space setting to sRGB. There's also a DCI-P3 setting if you want a gamut somewhere between the full native gamut and sRGB. And this doesn't restrict any of your other settings, so you can fully adjust color channels, contrast, whatever else you might want to adjust. But as I said, when I'm reviewing, I like to use the full wide gamut of the monitor, and I do explore the other settings separately. Next up's the image section. I set brightness to 60, which got close to the usual target I go for in reviews for consistency, and that's to reach a brightness of around 160 nits. That is also with uniform brightness enabled. If you disable that, the monitor can go brighter, so if you like things to go super bright sometimes and you don't mind a sort of dynamic contrast-like effect, then you could disable uniform brightness, but you're also going to get these shifts as the automatic brightness limiter ABL kicks in, depending on how much brightness is displayed on the screen. So these massive fluctuations, I find them really distracting. I don't like them. I prefer uniform brightness, but the option to disable it is there. Anything I'm not mentioning, by the way, I left at the default for racing mode, which is what you can see I'm using here as game visual. That includes the contrast being left at 80. OLED anti-flicker, I explore this in the review, and as I mentioned there, my preference is to set this to middle, but just refer to the review for further analysis on this. Color temp, I set that to user, red to 96, green to 98, blue to 100, which gave close to 6500K with a good neutral green channel on my unit. You can also see the various different preset color temperatures. So 4000K, that gives a warm, slightly amber tint to the image, and it is an effective low blue light setting, so you might find that more relaxing, perhaps in the evening, for example. So it's one that I actually like to use myself from time to time. There is an alternative low blue light setting called blue light filter. That's grayed out, unless you disable uniform brightness. So that is a really odd way of doing it. And has various different levels, level 4 being the strongest effect, but that locks the brightness to a low level because having a low brightness level will also reduce the blue light output, in fact all light output from the monitor. But level 3 gives a moderately strong effect. It also gives a bit of a green tint to the image. I prefer the amber look to the 4000K colour temperature setting, and of course you don't have to have this weird uniform brightness restriction, so I would just use that. But that's all I changed under SDR for my test settings. Variable refresh rate enabled, game visual set to racing mode, brightness set to 60, uniform brightness on, OLED anti-flicker set to middle, display color space set to wide gamut, and color temp at user with red 96, green 98 and blue 100. I'm now going to enable HDR and talk about that. I'm now in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR just to give you something more interesting to look at than the desktop, and this is actually HDR10 content, it's using HDR properly. Now I must preface this section by stating that the experiences I share here, they apply to my unit and my system. Things can vary based on different GPUs or systems, and even between units. Based on past models from ASUS, there doesn't seem to be absolute consistency with how the HDR settings behave. For example, sometimes changes are made in different firmware. My unit has MCM 102 firmware, and I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 5090 for reference. If you wish to customize your HDR experience in various ways, you can enable adjustable HDR in HDR setting. By default, this won't make any changes to the default setup, but it will unlock various settings such as saturation sliders, color temperature, and color channel control, as well as brightness. A few things to be aware of though. One is that changes to the color channels will reduce the brightness potential of the monitor and could affect calibration elsewhere. Slight changes to rebalance things, that's fine, but try to avoid huge changes there. As usual, if you reduce the brightness from the default of 100, it doesn't just neatly map the PQ curve to lower brightness limits. So if you make big changes there, it can knock off the balance as well, and the calibration can be upset significantly. Viewing comfort should always take priority though, so if you find the monitor uncomfortably bright, you should feel free to adjust this. But with that in mind, you might want to actually try the Display HDR 400 True Black setting. With its default brightness, it doesn't have the same strong brightness peaks or brightness potential as the other HDR settings, assuming default brightness settings are used, and it provides a more consistent experience with lower ABL behavior, automatic brightness limiter behavior, and good and appropriate dark and mid-tone brightness even in brighter or relatively high APL, average picture level, scenes. I did notice a bug though, or what I think was a bug. If I enabled adjustable HDR, it gave a lower brightness even when using the default settings if I switched between Display HDR 400 True Black and another setting. So I generally recommend only using the adjustable HDR setting if you actually wish to change some settings. And if you use multiple HDR modes and customize your settings to your liking, perhaps it's worth toggling adjustable HDR off then back on again after switching, just in case you do get the same bug. I was personally happy to leave adjustable HDR off and just use the presets of the monitor, which I'm going to go through now. I didn't find it useful or necessary to use the Windows HDR calibration tool to tweak the HDR experience on my unit, but feel free to have a play with it yourself if you want to. It's certainly useful though for giving an idea of the relative brightness calibration of the various HDR presets or settings of the monitor. In-game calibration sliders should show similar behavior, although that can depend on the game and how they've set the HDR calibration options up. So starting with the HDR True Black 400 setting, the peak luminance according to this test, that's around 450 nits. And that's in line with the actual measured values, which you can see in the review. Switching over to Gaming HDR, seems to be set to around 800 nits in this test. And that falls short of the actual capability, which slightly exceeds 1000 nits. Remember though, this tool gives an indication of the relative calibration of the screen, not the actual brightness levels you'll experience. So this is what some reviewers might refer to as more aggressive roll-off to the PQ EOTF curve using the Gaming HDR setting. It will cause over-brightening of some already bright shades, which can add a bit of extra pop in places, but can also reduce subtle variety for highlight detail. Switched over to the Cinema HDR setting. This is now set to around 1100 nits, which matches the maximum brightness capability quite closely in my testing. And this close match is how I personally prefer things to be set, as long as it doesn't mess other things up, such as dark shade representation, more on this shortly. And the console HDR setting, that's a weird one. You'll see straight away there's another option available now, Dynamic Brightness Boost, or what I'll call DBB for short. So without this activated first off, it's similar, it's around 1100 nits, similar to the Cinema HDR setting. Maybe a little bit lower, maybe 1080 nits I'd say. Again, it can vary between units, but that's how it is on my unit, and that's a good match for the maximum brightness capability of the screen. If I enable Dynamic Brightness Boost, it's now calibrated all the way down on this test to about 480 nits. Despite the actual physical luminance capability of the display being unchanged when you use this setting. So you'll get significant crushing of highlight detail unless you set the in-game calibration or Windows calibration tool to a level which will cap your luminance far below what the display is capable of. So that's all interesting, hopefully, but when you're in a game, obviously things are more complex, they're more complex environments, and you have to consider more than just how the brightest shades are represented. With all the settings I'm showcasing here, the game is calibrated appropriately for each setting. So I'm starting with the Display HDR 400 setting, or mode. Now, as I noted earlier, this is well calibrated, so it's a good kind of baseline to get your eye in here. So dark and mid-tones are shown well, they're shown largely appropriately. And some people, again, if you don't want the strong brightness peaks, then feel free to use this mode. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You might really enjoy the experience, so that would be the best setting for you. Just stick to that mode, simple. Use adjustable HDR and make your own changes as well on top if you wish. That's great, you get that flexibility on this model. I've switched over to gaming HDR and recalibrated things appropriately, and I can see a significant uplift to these dark shades now, and the dark to medium shades, they are represented in a brighter and more visible way. So some people might like that uplifted look, other people not so much. Let's say you don't want that kind of look, and you want more of a masked appearance like you got with Display HDR 400, but you also want some stronger brightness peaks where they're applicable. A good option would be the console HDR mode with DBB disabled. So that gives a nice blended look to these dark elements. It's got a nice atmospheric look. In this particular scene, you can't see any strong peaks of brightness, which would go really beyond the Display HDR 400 setting, the Display HDR 400 True Black setting. But in other scenes, and you're using this mode, you would see the strong brightness peaks. There are some measurements in the review if you're interested, by the way, to learn a bit more about these modes and the potential brightness output there, with some actual in-game examples. With DBB enabled, remember what I said about the calibration earlier. To be honest, the medium shades are completely uplifted as well as the medium dark shades, and I get lower than optimal peak brightness capabilities because of the fact I've had to calibrate the in-game slider to avoid crushing the highlight detail, and that does cap my luminance. As I mentioned before, I don't like this setting, it's not calibrated well. If you really want that uplifted look, just stick to gaming HDR or cinema HDR, and I'm just going to switch over to cinema HDR and recalibrate things appropriately. So yeah, there's a nice uplifted look here, and it's not an extreme uplift, it doesn't look completely flooded or washed out, and there's much better distinction now for the medium and medium bright shades as well. So really, I'm a bit split between which setting I personally prefer using. So there's this setting, Cinema HDR, or Console HDR with the brightness boost disabled. So remember, this gives a more masked appearance to those dark shades. But like the Cinema HDR setting, it's also going to give you nice pop to smaller bright elements where they're available in the scene, as well as good uncrushed highlight detail. So yeah, I can certainly appreciate this Console HDR setting without the DBB active, especially if I'm in a dark room as I am now, and I can appreciate all the little subtle dark details and things look nice and atmospheric and deep. So this could definitely be considered a best setting. At the same time, this Cinema HDR setting, it's providing those good brightness peaks without crushing highlight detail. It's giving a nice boost to medium shades in daylight scenes as well. I'll explore that more in the review. But the negative compared to Console HDR without DBB is just that uplifted look to the dark details. I'd again stress that it's not an extreme uplift, not compared to what I've seen on some models with these kind of settings. And it doesn't affect the darkest details either, so the darkest shades remain nice and dark and deep. I've brightened the room up a bit, and I'd add, if you are playing in a room that's at least moderately bright, this is moderately bright, it's not super bright and it's not uncontrolled lighting, then you might actually find this uplifted look to the cinema setting appealing, appropriate and nice to have. Whereas with Console HDR, which I've just switched over to, you might find things are just too masked now and you really can't pick out those little subtle details anyway, so you'd prefer the uplifted look instead. So I would definitely recommend trying out both of the settings and seeing which one works for you. Perhaps other settings if you're feeling adventurous or these particular settings don't work out for you. I'm now on Lagom.nl, the website, and the black levels test. I'm back in SDR, by the way. I'm just going to talk a little bit about visibility enhancement on the monitor, if that's what you want to do. Be aware that what you see on the video does not represent exactly what you'd see by eye, but it will give you an idea of the relative change some of the settings I'm going to go through will make. If you change the game visual preset to some of the other settings like FPS mode, that does actually give quite a nice uplift. So the visibility of the dark shades is increased quite a lot. That's actually because it by default enables something called shadow boost, and also reduces the gamma setting, which means that shades other than black and white are brightened up a bit. But if you switch to racing mode or stick with racing mode or user mode, which are the ones I said I would switch between just for the sort of general use of the monitor, you can manually configure shadow boost and gamma. So shadow boost first. Level 1 gives the mildest uplift, very slight uplift. Level 2 a little bit stronger, very gradual effect here. Level 3 a little bit stronger again. Dynamic shadow boost, that gives the most significant uplift. It maintains good black depth, by the way. It doesn't touch black, and also the very brightest shades are represented quite well as well, so it's reasonably targeted in the shades it's giving an uplift for, designed for better visibility in dark areas and games, that kind of thing. If you're finding this isn't doing enough for you, so some of those very dark shades on the first row there, certainly not as visible as they could be still, just reduce the gamma, so 1.8 would give you the strongest uplift. So with these two combined, you can now see, or I can see by eye at least, all of the Lagom squares, and there's a significant uplift compared to how things would appear by default. Again, be aware that you're not seeing exactly what you'd see by eye, but both by eye and in the video you could see that there was a significant difference using those settings versus not. And I do like to go through the crosshairs just because people like to see them in action and just see roughly how they look on a monitor if the option's available. So there is a crosshair option in Game Plus here. Various different designs, little blue or green dot, or small cross, or a large cross. You can also change the position of the crosshair now using the joystick once it's on the screen. There's also a dynamic crosshair option. There are 3 designs again, but they're not coloured anymore. Reason for that is that the crosshair will change depending on the background shade, so it tries to contrast with whatever the background shade is. And I believe I've said this on ASUS monitors before, but there should really be an option to just reset the crosshair to the centre of the screen, but don't seem to find that option, so I think you just have to reset all of the monitor settings if you wanted to do that, or just manually reposition it yourself if you're comfortable doing that. And to finish off, I'm just going to take a quick look at the OLED Care settings. So this screensaver, and what this will do is it will allow various sections of the screen to dim independently of the rest of the screen. I haven't really played around with this, so I'm not sure exactly what each of the settings does, but it's got screen dimming control, outer dimming control, and global dimming control. Of course, outer dimming control will be peripheral regions of the screen which can dim. Usually it gives a sort of vignetting when that happens, but I'm not sure what the difference between global and screen dimming control is. But what I'd suggest with any of these settings is try all of them out and just leave them enabled if they don't annoy you. If they do annoy you, then disable them. You might notice that I have quite a few of these disabled. That's because I don't want them to interrupt the review, not necessarily because they annoy me, but it's really quite an individual thing whether you'd find them annoying or not. With that said, I do generally find these sort of screensaver settings where parts of the screen dim annoying because one of the attractions of OLED monitors, particularly QD OLEDs, is the excellent uniformity, and that really goes away when you've got this sort of screensaver setting active. There's pixel cleaning. That allows you to manually run the pixel cleaning cycle. And there's also a pixel cleaning reminder. Now you don't have to manually run the cycle. It'll try and run it when the screen is switched off or it loses a signal to the system, so the screen goes into standby as long as it has power running to the screen. I'm not sure how long it waits before trying to do this. It seems like mine will try and do it if the screen goes off after I've been using it cumulatively for maybe 3 hours or so, which is quite aggressive. But I think they do it this way because they assume that a lot of the time people will just interrupt the cycle, so maybe you'll just briefly have your system on standby and it won't actually complete the cycle anyway. I'm not entirely sure, but it's just something that runs in the background. It takes about 6 minutes, and if you try to turn the monitor on or interrupt the process, that's fine, you can interrupt it. If you go on OLED usage info, it will tell you how long the monitor's been used in total, the screen on time, that they call OLED time track. Pixel clean times, so how many times it's run the cycle, and pixel clean interval, how long ago it last ran the cycle. So with the reminder, it just gives you a little message on the screen. You can have that after 2, 4 or 8 hours if you want, or you can have it switched off as I do now. This doesn't affect whether the cycle is going to run or not. There's a screen move setting, so as usual there's an active area of unused pixels around the image and between the image and the panel border, and the screen will just nudge itself left, right, up or down occasionally within that border. And it does that more aggressively with the strong setting, a bit less with middle and less with light, or you can have that switched off if it really annoys you. I personally found middle just fine, and it doesn't interrupt the review in any way, so I just left it like that. Auto logo brightness, so this will detect small static elements on the screen, such as logos, if you've got logo detection enabled. It's also got taskbar detection, which will look at, for example, the Windows taskbar, but it could be a taskbar in an application as well, and dim those, as they do tend to be static elements. And there's boundary detection, which can look at the edges between windows and dim those. I did have a little play with these settings and I didn't really find them annoying, so hopefully you wouldn't find them annoying either, and you can just leave them enabled. But it could depend on the specific content you're viewing and of course just how you might subjectively find it. Sometimes you can see a bit of a shadowiness with this kind of setting. I didn't really notice that here. And this I really like, the Neo proximity sensor. This will turn the screen off after a given amount of time. And really it blanks the screen out, so it shows a completely black screen, which on an OLED means that the pixels are switched off. With that said, it isn't the same as putting the screen into standby, and the pixel cleaning cycle doesn't seem to run if the screen is switched off because of the Neo proximity sensor. For that reason, I'd actually recommend also using Windows Power Management set to a longer duration than you've got the Neo proximity sensor, just as a backup, unless you are used to turning your screen off when you leave the room or you know you're not going to be using it for a little bit. Then it can run the pixel cleaning cycle as well. But anyway, tailored mode, that allows you to customize the distance that the infrared sensor will look out to try and detect your presence. And remember, that is the maximum distance it will look out to. So I'd recommend just sit like you normally would, but perhaps a little bit further back or as far back as you'd ever tend to sit. And then it'll hopefully work well for you. Or if it doesn't, just use one of the preset values. And screen off, that allows you to choose how long you want to be away from the monitor before it switches off. So there's 5, 10 or 15 minutes. I would have preferred to have a 2 or 3 minute setting personally. When I first got the monitor on the original firmware, there was actually a 1 minute setting, but that was too aggressive and I found it was frequently not detecting me, perhaps because I don't move enough for perhaps a minute or so at a time occasionally, if I'm deep in thought or something like that. So I get why they got rid of that, but I still would have liked to see 2 or 3 minutes as an option. Nonetheless, the setting did work very nicely and reliably for me, and the screen did spring back to life very quickly when I returned to the desk.